One. Ismail Abdulsalam, BeatsBoxingMayhem.com. I'm here with a very special guest. We're going to be talking about his new book entitled Murder on Federal Street, Tyrone Everett, The Black Mafia, Fixed Fights, and the Last Golden Age of Philadelphia Boxing. I'm here with none other than Sean Nam. Sean, thank you for making time, and congratulations on this new project.
I appreciate it, Ismail. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And I am working on my own true crime book, which is basically talking about the Murder Inc. era in the 1940s, and all the research I've had to do. I was very ecstatic to see someone else has gotten to the finish line with your book. So I always ask people who have done true crime books, what drew you to this story in particular? Because it's an obscure fighter from the 1970s, a black southpaw at that in the 1970s. What drew you to bring his story back to the forefront after all these years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think among kind of boxing people who are familiar with the fight scene from the 70s, 80s, way in the past, Tyrone Everett has kind of a special place. This is a guy who was arguably, he's double-crossed twice. There was an infamous title fight that he lost, and 6 months later, he was shot dead by his girlfriend in South Philadelphia. Now, it's not often, boxing is kind of a breeding ground for a lot of sad and sordid tales. But Everett combined, with his age, he was only 24, with his profile, it was, at the time, seemingly growing exponentially. Combined with these two kind of heinous incidents, gives him kind of a particular, I think, spot in boxing history. So he's, as you mentioned, he's an obscure fighter. Almost nobody knows him. But I think the circumstances are a bit greater. They're he was kind of caught up in both the kind of boxing, kind of the subterranean channels of boxing, and also the underworld of the streets, which kind of was his, that was his home in a sense. That's where he came from. I don't know if that answers your question particularly, but the fact that there had been so much irresolution into both the title fight and then his death, I thought would make I thought it was the right time to kind of bring the story to the forefront.
Got it. Absolutely answered the question. And then the next phase would be, once you decide this is where I'm going to go, then you have to start looking at the records. I was curious how easy it was to obtain the police records, everything that you needed to get as far as documentation, the trial and everything, to really bring the story back to the forefront. How was that process for you?
Well, so the research really took place. I really relied heavily on newspaper accounts from Philadelphia, the local papers, the Inquirer, the Daily News, the Tribune. There was another paper in Jersey that covered a lot of kind of the sporting world in Philadelphia. So that was key to get contemporaneous accounts of his life and his career. But it was also important to get, these events happened nearly 50 years ago, but many of the participants, people who knew Tyrone, are still around. And so I was fortunate to be able to talk to first his promoter, J. Russell Peltz, his manager, Frank Gelb, and also his brother, Eddie. And there are several other kind of ancillary folks that I was able to speak to around that time. but having three guys who played an important role in both the life and career of Tyrone Everett was really fundamental. And it really, again, we're talking about an obscure fighter. There's not much on the guy. There's not much tape on the guy. We're not talking about Sugar Ray Leonard. I didn't have. There's another polar problem that other people might have when they're writing kind of a biography is there's too much information. I had the exact opposite. There wasn't enough. So to get the kind of what we call, I guess, background and color, it was important that I talked to people who kind of knew him really well in their own aspects. Peltz, the promoter, was really integral. He was Peltz. Part of the subtitle of the book is "The Last Golden Age of Philadelphia Boxing," and that's in part really due to Peltz's savvy and efforts at the time. Tyrone grew up in came of an age where Philadelphia boxing landed on the map, on the prize fighting map. We talk about guys like Boogaloo Watts and Benny Briscoe, Saad Matthew Muhammad, guys like that seem to just come off the tongue when somebody brings up Philadelphia boxing, and Tyrone was the part of that era, and it was really fortunate to have access to people like Peltz who were able to describe their interactions with Everett as he was coming up.
Right, and you mentioned the rich history of Philadelphia boxing. The time that he passed in 1977, that was a transition period, I feel, for Philadelphia boxing, because by that time, Frazier's career was winding down after the Thriller in Manila and losing the Foreman the second time. You had Benny Briscoe that was still around. His career was a little bit up and down. Eugene Hart's career was starting to slow down a little bit. So I kind of feel it's almost a double tragedy, of course, in losing his life, but at the time, I feel like the Philadelphia scene was kind of open for someone like him who was undefeated, had a completely different style, being a southpaw, being someone that relished outboxing and not getting hit. Do you feel if he could have lived a little bit longer, possibly gotten the title, could he have changed the perception of how Philadelphia fighters fight? A generation after Muhammad Ali, majority of the heavyweights tried to fight like him. Do you think that Tyrone could have had a similar type of impact with Philadelphia fighters and how they approach the fight game?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, right? The question of legacy and the kind of influence you impart. There seem to be two camps. Obviously, if you talk to the Everett family, there's a thinking that if he had lived on, we're talking about a superstar. We're talking about a guy who would have beat Duran, Arguello. So, you think about some of the big names at lightweight that period, and you consider that Tyrone was, a top contender. It's not, far-fetched at all to think that he would have fought some of these names. Would he have beat them? I don't know. Peltz is, he was Tyrone's promoter, but Peltz will tell you he doesn't think that Everett would have beaten the likes of Duran. It may have been very competitive, but I think Peltz needed to see more. And you mentioned, his style. Yeah, it was very atypical at the time. And, in the book, I do make a point of continually referring to this kind of outsider reputation he has amongst the kind of hardcore Philadelphia fan base. They wanted to see two guys bashing each other in the ring. They didn't want to see a guy, a southpaw no less, flitting away after throwing a jab, and then mocking a guy, because he couldn't hit him. These are things that were absolutely verboten at the time, and Tyrone had no problem, going against that kind of those principles. I think it's really interesting. He was in talks briefly. I don't think there was nothing concrete, but he had. You would meet Duran, somebody like Duran, at a fight, and they would talk about possibly fighting each other down the line. There was, I believe, something drawn in the sand when he had his title fight with Alfredo Escalera. If he had won that, there was a deal in place for him to be co-promoted by Top Rank. And part of that deal, I think, would have gotten him in the ring with somebody like Duran at the end of it. So it's really tantalizing to think about that, to think that that kind of style, today we see a lot more of it, and fighters are praised for it. Certainly Floyd Mayweather comes to mind. But you're right. I think if he had lived on, if there was, he had just missed the big kind of television boom that happened in the late 70s, early 80s. He had been around, and people had seen more of it. Maybe he beats Duran. I don't know. People would say, no, it's crazy. That would never happen. Duran was just too skilled. But, that may have, if he wins a couple of big fights here and there, that could absolutely change some of the perception about Philadelphia boxing, particularly the style. Tyrone would probably have to come up as a caveat to the discussions about these kind of hard-nosed sluggers. Certainly that was the kind of revelation I had when I was doing the research for the book, was how central he was to this movement, in a sense. He was in the thick of it, and he was not unpopular. That was the thing. This guy was drawing, maybe after Benny Briscoe, second best in Philadelphia at the time. He was doing terrific gates, albeit they were from a particular section of Philadelphia, South Philadelphia. He had a very loyal crowd. And, it's interesting, yeah. He, scorned by some factions of the Philadelphia fight fan base, and then, on the other hand, totally beloved. And I think it's evident by, when he died, the tremendous outpouring that came out, the reportedly thousands of people who came to his funeral. So, again, he was 24, and all we can do is kind of guess and surmise and, and wonder.
Right. And just to build on that, you talked about the division between the fight fans. In your research, did you feel like there was also a bit of division or tension with the fighters? Because there are a few quotes that you put in there where I won't say Everett was derisive about Benny Briscoe's style or Eugene Hart's style, but in his mind, of course, with his confidence, he felt he should have been at the forefront, that he should never be on the undercard when those guys were on the card. Do you feel like there was any animosity between the fighters, because of the divide?
Yeah, I would think so. That's a good point. I never was able to track down reaction from somebody like Briscoe. Maybe they thought Tyrone was just this little kid, little kind of bat in the wind. But you're right, though. He was polarizing, and I would have to think, the way he treated some of the fighters that he fought, that it probably wasn't that beloved by his peers. In the book, I do describe one instance how he would really dress down the fighters in the build-up to a fight. And particularly the fighter Sammy Goss, who at the time was considered an elite lightweight, at least on the East Coast, kind of lost his composure. Sammy Goss was a guy known to be kind of a silent, hard-working, hard-scrabble, the kind of prototypical Philly fighter, and he kind of snapped, because all the badgering and all the trash talking going on. Yeah, he really rubbed people the wrong way, Tyrone. And it wasn't uncommon for a lot of the kind of newspaper guys at the time to be like, what the hell, this kid is, he's really crossing your line with all this, smack talking, before, after, during the fights. And yeah, I mean, it was a lightning rod of controversy. There are a lot of ways that kind of puts him in line with somebody like Muhammad Ali, who was, is very, very brash at a time when prize fighters weren't expected to do that. And, I guess you could say Joe Louis was kind of the prototype of how fighters should behave. But then you can go back even further and see glimpses of somebody like Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was, kind of the anti-establishment fighter of yore. And I certainly think, I don't think Tyrone was reading a biography of Jack Johnson at the time. Maybe he was. But you see parts of that in Tyrone, and the way he was, really kind of a thorn in the side of, admittedly a very white boxing culture in Philadelphia, at least among kind of the aficionados.
Exactly right. And I know a lot of people who are listening now, like you said, there's not a lot of footage out there on YouTube about Tyrone Everett. So they're probably trying to visualize his style. But there are some fights out there. The Escalera fight, which we'll talk about shortly, his lone title opportunity. What stood out to me is that he has a very stinging left jab, very good with counter left hooks as well, very nimble footwork. But mentality-wise, we talked about this earlier when you mentioned how he dressed down a lot of his opponents. With all great fighters, they have a mean streak, and he definitely had a mean streak, not just with the tongue, but also some of the fighters that he went after in the ring, especially when he saw blood. And, he seemed to relish being able to cut fighters and get stoppages that way. But as you mentioned, what Russell Peltz said, he also had a bit of a cold streak where he would kind of coast a little bit. From what you were researching, just talk a little bit about kind of that mentality where he could be so hot and cold in the ring with his opponents. I know that was probably very frustrating for Peltz as a promoter.
Yeah, I think Peltz saw a lot of potential. He saw a guy who could really, if he wanted to, knock guys out each time out. Everett, he would go between, he would have a huge knockout one night, and then for the next several fights, he would be content getting a decision. I think fight fans are notoriously difficult to please, and it's a criticism I think that pops up pretty frequently these days as well for certain fighters. I think in the Escalera fight there was a lot of that fight was important in one respect. Even though he lost, he did show the kind of mettle he had in the late rounds. He's bleeding from the forehead, bleeding quite profusely, and he kind of, in the last several rounds, he really turns it up, which is not something you would see from a lot of his fights. And he was turning it up another level against a guy who was the champion of the division. And I think that may have done more than a few things to some of the more stubborn members of the kind of old fight crew. But yeah, I think that was one of those paradoxes. He was a defensive fighter where he didn't quite need to be at some points. And I think kind of figuring that out obviously led to some frustrations, at least for the public's reception. his fights, and it's, could he have completely changed his style as his career went on? It's hard to say. I think in the book I make it clear that this is a guy who really did not like getting hit. He did not like getting his face scratched up. And he was very self-aware of the kind of fighters that were around him. The fighters who were getting knockouts and would, as the saying goes, take two and land one. He'd see some of these guys in the game kind of traipsing along, and I think that really triggered in his head, I don't want to be like that. And some of the remarks he made to reporters, leading into the title fight, you could tell this guy was super aware of where he was at. There's a quotation where he says, I've been in the game. I'm paraphrasing, but he's been in the game for a long time, and I'm getting kind of up there. He's only 24, but he almost felt like his time, is coming to an end. And in fact, he was right.
Very true. And we've talked a little bit about the title match against Escalera, so let's go right into that. A lot of us know, boxing fans, Alfredo Escalera, very decorated champion, had 2 celebrated battles with Alexis Arguello, which he lost both of those, very bloody battles. So the fact that Harold Lederman, who was an observer of this fight, he mentions, as you quoted, he said this was the worst decision he ever saw. And as we know, he's seen a lot of boxing with his work with HBO Boxing. For the younger fans, you might not also be aware, Harold was even involved in his own controversial decision. He's one of the judges with the rubber match with Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton, which he scored for Ali. So for him to say that holds a lot of weight, to say that this was the worst decision he ever saw. Just talk about, a little bit, because I know you're going in depth in the book, just a little bit of why a lot of people were just completely irate about this particular decision in Everett's hometown of Philadelphia.
Well, that was part of it, right? It's your hometown. The title fight is in your hometown, and you figure that gives you a little bit of leeway. It's always a bit. There's always a bit of that wink going on, but you would think that there is something like a home court advantage for the hometown fighter, but the fact that the judge who had scored against Tyrone, or one of the judges, was from Philadelphia, made this a little bit harder to digest. And I would say that was kind of the first inkling that something was truly wrong. And if you talk to somebody like Peltz, he's convinced the fight was fixed, and part of that stems from the character, the judge Lou Tress, who never judged another fight after that night. There's an image he recalls, Russell Peltz recalls, of Lou Tress running up the stairs out of the arena right after the scorecards were announced. The scorecards were announced, but there was something of a, the officials were so perplexed, and the kind of ringside observers and officials, really Peltz, were completely apoplectic that they decided to hold off on calling the fight. What that was they didn't want the arena to come tearing down by a riot. The crowd was incensed. And one kind of really canny move was to delay the official announcement. Really, what they were trying to do was just try to prevent a riot. But yeah, like, you know, again, the I guess I can go a bit more into this, but Lou Tress had connections to people from, I think you know pretty well from the 40s and 50s underworld scene, Frankie Carbo, whatnot, and other guys from kind of Murder Incorporated group. But as you kind of put together kind of these disparate strands, it's hard to look at that fight and look at the results and not think that something was inherently wrong.
Right, definitely. And when the fallout for that happens, it's devastating, not just for the fighter, but everybody involved. And in a sense, you can argue that these type of decisions, they change everyone. And Everett kind of mentioned that before. Like you said, he knew that his time was short. And this was he implied that his time might be short in the ring. And this was a very bitter pill for him to swallow. And then when things like this happen, unfortunately, you start lashing out at those closest around you. And in this case, that would be his promoter, Peltz, and his manager, Frank Leb, who he felt in a way failed him. He actually has a quote in your book about he felt that maybe they were too nice for this type of business. What were your thoughts on that? Because that to me, I feel like a promoter and a manager to hear that would not only be hurtful, in a way it might be unforgivable. It might completely just change the dynamics of the relationship that they would have with the fighter going forward. How did you feel that changed your relationship, if it did, in that fallout?
Well, Frank Gallup, the manager, made it clear to me that he was a changed person after that night. Both Gallup and Peltz, Gallup was nearly 10 years older than Peltz, but Peltz was in his late 20s. This is a really young guy. He's a kid in a way. Mm-hmm. And they came into this sport with hugely idealistic notions, and that notion, respecting that notion and playing to it, contributed to this great, vigorous culture of prize fighting at the time. Now, fixed fights, people talk about that all the time in boxing, but they talk about it in relation to the period of the 50s and 40s, after the 60s, it doesn't make sense to talk about it because the model had basically been removed from prize fighting. So that's, Peltz and Gallup, they're thinking, all that's behind them, they're going to promote shows, they're going to have fun doing it. And then when this happens, it just, changes their outlook overnight. I think Peltz, being really the kind of the boxing maniac, was able to take it a bit better. But from what Gallup told me, he really grew disenchanted. So in the book, he says something like, I used to go to the gym all the time. I would be around the fighters, check in on his fighters. And after the event, he kind of stopped doing that. He kind of went away from that. And Peltz says Gallup became a bit more difficult to deal with. For example, he just wanted a higher paycheck for Tyrone for each fight. Whereas in the past, there might have been a bit more negotiating, a bit more willingness to negotiate. So stuff like that, I think that really cast really created kind of a bad taste in their mouths. I think to your initial comment about Tyrone feeling that Gail was perhaps too naive, Gelman Peltz being too naive. Yeah, I think, this is a guy who, you have to remember, he was not, Tyrone grew up in poverty, basically. In a section of Philadelphia that was rife with a lot of small-time street gangs. In fact, he was a member of one of them, the 2050 Carpenters, I believe, at one point, and he got out. But, what does it mean to get out? I think, in a sense, that part is always with you. And, did Tyrone, would Tyrone have moved away from his handlers? Possibly. It's hard to say, although, if you look at the kind of track record of fighters moving, changing promoters or managers or trainers, it's a pretty long track record. So, but I'm not sure what he would have done. They had a rematch scheduled, basically penciled in, right before he died. So yeah.
I see. And keeping with that theme about changes, let's kind of speculate a little bit about Tyrone himself. Now, he did have 2 fights after this decision, both knockouts. Now, they were lower tier guys, probably protecting the rematch and the one taking any risks. But he did knock them out, and this was something that, we hadn't seen consistently with him, really just taking out lower level fighters and showing that they're not worthy to be in the ring with him. Did you get an idea from your research that maybe he was getting more meaner and more aggressive now that he knew that he couldn't take any chances with these guys based on what happened with the Escalera decision?
Yeah, I don't have any firm reporting on that, but that sounds really sensible, right? You get a sense that the guy, Tyrone is handling at this point several of his own businesses, and I think he's starting to think more pragmatically about maybe his career. So it's entirely possible, but it's 2 fights, and it's hard to say. Both of them were pretty undistinguished opponents. The rematch, it would have been interesting to see the rematch. That's all I can say. That would have been in Puerto Rico, so who knows? But yeah, it's one of the big what ifs.
Right, definitely a big what if because so much is left on the table. We saw what Hagler did after the Vito draw in his first fight, and that showed him exactly what he needed to do in the rematch. Stage would have been perfectly set for Tyrone to have a legacy-making fight if he were to be able to defeat Escalera in Puerto Rico, which is what Arguello did a few years later when he finally got a chance to fight him. Let's go to the big tragedy, which would be his murder, which happened just 6 months after the Escalera fight. He was killed by his girlfriend, Carolyn McKendrick. Very sensational trial. I almost feel like this trial was kind of ready-made for the social media era. Like if something like this happened today, I can just imagine the furor online and just everywhere. His girlfriend, Carolyn McKendrick, she was married at the time, and not only was she married to someone named Ricardo McKendrick, who was affiliated with the Philadelphia Black Mafia, who was notorious for a lot of the crimes that they committed. Just talk a little bit about the difference between how this trial was presented in the 1970s as opposed to how it may have been presented today with the whole battered woman syndrome, having speculation about a homosexual relationship. How was that played in the 70s as opposed to how you think it would have played out today with this audience?
Well, I think a lot differently. You touched on those 2 aspects. The battered woman syndrome, that was a term that I think that was developed that same year, a different trial by another lawyer. But certainly there were the cultural mores and notions of political correctness that we have now did not exist in 1977 in South Philadelphia. And you will, you can glean it simply from some of the remarks made by both the prosecution and the defense. Really, the defense had no problem, characterizing, Tyrone a certain way, a way that certainly would not fly in today's kind of, 24/7, kind of media scrutiny. The case was scandalous in part not only because the girlfriend had killed the boxer, the hotshot boxer, but also the presence of the witness, who remarkably was also named Tyrone, but went by Terry, Tyrone Price, who was a cross-dressing gay drug dealer. And you can tell from a lot of the newspaper accounts, there was really very little know-how on how to proceed to talk about that person, that character. And, there's a kind of, descriptions about Price's dress, the kind of the earrings that he would wear, the high-pitched voice that he would assume, a lot of the kinds of things that really lend to a sensationalized coverage of the trial. And I think that, you might say they're just reporting, but what that ended up doing was really, I think, kind of obscuring the trial itself and how it's remembered. A lot of people seem to think that it came out during the trial that Tyrone was gay and that he was possibly, sleeping with this drug dealer and all that, but none of that is kind of based on empirical reality. These things were talked about and brought up by the defense, so it's completely mediated through this trial. But of course, that's what gets the attention. So, part of what I try to do in the book is lay out each element of the trial, and the readers can see it themselves, but it shows you what things were talked about within the court of law and how they came to be part of what we now know as Tyrone Everett's story. Again, it was a sensational trial, but there were a lot of question marks still left behind. There were things that the prosecution simply did not want to litigate. For example, the presence of 40-odd packets of drugs on the dining room table. That was never something that was resolved in court. But yeah, I would say, if this took place today, boy, I don't know. It would it would certainly make for some high view counts, I would think. Would it do the numbers that the Gwyneth Paltrow case did, which is admittedly for far smaller stakes? I don't know, but it certainly would have certainly caused a ruckus, I think, at least in the kind of Philadelphia area.
Definitely, we definitely know that. I just think especially because we get so much disinformation that happens on social media. Just this story, just the facts enough can make it sensational where it would be a nationwide story. But I can just see somebody just twisting something on their TikTok and having it blow up, and there'd be so many different stories about what really happened. So I think this would be it would have been the perfect template for just, a modern day wild story. But like you said, the results of the trial was, the shooter, she did get 5 years in prison, which a lot of people were not happy of. A lot was still left unresolved about possibly someone else pulling the trigger based on her husband's background with the Black Mafia. You go in depth about some of the characters involved there and her family history. But also very intriguing to me is you sought to get some of those resolved answers taken care of by reaching out to Carolyn herself, who's still alive 50 years later, and you were able to make contact. I'll leave it for in the book what exactly happened. But for you as a reporter, at a certain point, especially when you're writing a book, you kind of have to wrap it up, even if you're not going to get all the answers you sought out to get initially. What was your point where you were able to comfortably walk away, even after speaking with Carolyn? Because some people, it's hard to let that go. I'm sure it was hard for you too. How were you able just to say, okay, I've done my best, I've gotten the most I can get, now it's time to, wrap up and present what I do have?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think so. There had been some pretty good stories on attempting to kind of grapple with the kind of unsavory connections that Tyrone had to the underworld. You mentioned kind of a conspiracy about maybe somebody else that pulled the trigger. Now those suppositions and rumors have been rampant at the time of the trial, but it also becomes something of the unspoken truth for some people, and where I felt comfortable walking away or finishing the book was that I was able to connect what people have previously referred to as, street ruffians, people from the underworld. It was all kind of nebulous, but in the book I connected specifically to the Black Mafia, which was a pretty horrific kind of criminal organization at the time. They ran the dope trade in Philadelphia and were infamous for some of their gangland slayings. And it was only through academic Sean Patrick Griffin who wrote the book on the Black Mafia and presented to the public for the first time that there had been a completely kind of autonomous and organized black criminal operation in Philadelphia at the time. These crimes were, the Black Mafia is probably most famous for their attempted slaying of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. That made national headlines back in the day. But their reputation as a whole was was non-existent, and it wasn't until Griffin wrote in his book that you had, he had mapped out, basically a really chilling portrait of a group that had always been maybe characterized as kind of scattershot, and which is somewhat ironic when you think back, when you think about our culture's obsession with the mafia and with organized criminal operations in general. You think about the Italian mob, the Jewish mob, and so on and so forth. But that kind of recognition seems to have eluded the Black Mafia. And to be able to say, the person to whom Carolyn McKendrick was married was a high-ranking Black Mafia member, for me, was a way to, not only present new details and, present these details in a fashion that had never been presented before. I think that kind of allowed me to be like, okay, maybe I didn't get everybody I wanted to get, but I can look back and say, this had never been part of the Everett narrative. Now we can kind of put a face to some of these rumors and conjectures at the time. And if nothing else, I think that allows us to think a little bit differently about the tragedy. And that Tyrone, in fact, whatever may or may not have happened, was indeed, wrapped up in some pretty dark stuff.
Absolutely, that is an understatement. And as far as mysteries go, one also stuck with me. We mentioned the gay crossdresser and drug dealer Tyrone Price. Did you ever get any rumors about or anything about what may have happened to him after the trial and everything? He seems to be one person out of everyone, just the one person that seems to completely have dropped off the radar, which is surprising based on how he presented himself. You would think he'd be one of the easier ones to find.
Well, that's if I could get in touch with Tyrone Price, that would have been truly amazing. But it doesn't surprise me that he was difficult to find. He got nowhere on that front. But a lot of people indeed do live off the grid. A lot of people from the underworld, a lot of people who make their living on the streets, aren't available like other people. They don't have a Facebook account. Maybe they do. They don't. They don't have a LinkedIn. It's not the same guy. It's not. They're not. They're not part of so-called society as somebody from, I don't know, I'm nitpicking here, but somebody from Scarsdale, New York would be,
Right. It's
just not that world. It's two different worlds, and it's something that I was not able to do within the limits of my reporting. But certainly, if Tyrone Price is out there, that's somebody who I would think would be absolutely central in trying to get his thoughts. Alas.
Right, and I will just add on to that, Mr. Price, if you happen to be listening to this or anyone that knows him, please reach out to me, and I will definitely get in touch with you, Sean. And we can always update the book, do a second edition. I would absolutely love to hear his perspective, being the other person that was in the room that night. Okay, so just to wrap everything up, we've covered a lot of topics about Tyrone's passing, his in-ring ability, his early life. It's always hard to try and sum everything up, so I won't say what his legacy should be because that should be determined by the readers. But what do you hope people who are coming to this book, who purchased it for the first time, what is the main thing you want them to take away from Tyrone Everett's life?
I want them to take away the fact that in 1976, 1977, there was a fighter who captivated a city, who for a moment seemed to be the biggest thing going on in South Philadelphia. And whose ambition, his dream, was the same thing. That same thing was what caused his downfall in the end. And it's that irony that I think attracted me to this story so much. That's what I would say.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect summary to do. Just to remind everybody, the name of the book is Murder on Federal Street, Tyrone Everett, The Black Mafia, Fixed Fights, and the Last Golden Age of Philadelphia Boxing. Available wherever you get your favorite books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Just put it in, you'll be able to find it. Also, for those of you who are listening on YouTube, you'll see the link in the description of this video to make your purchase. Sean Nam, I thank you so much for making time to speak with me about it. We've almost went a full hour. I think we've covered a lot. And just for people out there who may be speculating, we just scratched the surface. So don't think we went through the entire book. We did not. It's definitely worth picking up to go in depth about the trial, his in-ring boxing career, his personality, family life, early upbringing. All of that is covered extensively in this book. Sean, thanks again for your time today, and looking forward to all of your future projects that you may put out there for us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.